is called Explicit Cross-Border Participation, which I might say a lot during this podcast.
This wasn't in the script, but I have a sort of curious question.
The biggest problem we have, and if our listeners have suggestions, we're very happy to hear them, is which to do first.
Yeah.
We have two really important topics, but we only have one Emma. That's the biggest problem we have right now. Welcome to the new season of the FSR Policy Briefcase, still with Leonardo, Meeus.
And me, James Kneebone.
And Emma. Emma, welcome to the show. So, first of all, new season. We promised that maybe our new colleagues, Cyril and Michele, would bring us to the beach. It's sort of a beach, right? With this blue light thing here.
Yes, I mean, it's freezing cold. It feels like maybe a Belgian beach in winter, but yeah, the lighting is warm. We can say that.
Is it beach enough for you, Emma?
Yeah. I also like all the plants here. Really cozy.
So this time it's with Emma, and Emma, you should know, is a researcher in our team who joined us from Paris. But as her name suggests, she has Italian roots. So Emma, after doing your master thesis, we were very happy you stayed with us also for the PhD. You're 1 year into the PhD. And as many researchers at FSR, you're already doing much more than PhD. You're engaging, you're blogging, and you're now part of our policy briefcase because you have a policy brief that is coming out. So welcome, Emma.
Well, thank you very much for having me again, this time for our policy brief.
Yeah, it seems like a perfect way to start the second season after Emma was our first guest along with Ellen on the first season. And during the second half of that season, we spoke with several experts about the various ways electricity can be procured, including different types of long-term contracts like power purchase agreements and contracts for difference, right? So I myself am becoming increasingly educated on the topic, very much against my will, I would add. But just as I think I'm getting to grips with it, Leo puts another type of contract on my desk. And the flavor of this month is something called capacity mechanisms or capacity remuneration mechanisms or CRMs, if you like acronyms, not to be confused with critical raw materials. But fortunately for me and for the listeners, we have Emma and Leo here to explain what these are, how they work, or rather don't in some cases, as well as how and why we might go about improving them. Their ideas are also written down in a recent policy brief. You can find link below this podcast episode. To start though, perhaps it's important to make a distinction between today's subject of capacity markets and the kind of contracts that I mentioned before. If I understand well, we use long-term energy procurement contracts, like these PPAs or CFDs, primarily to support renewables generation. And in their design, they are focused on the production and delivery of energy in specific volumes and at a precise moment in time. Capacity mechanisms, however, are concerned with ensuring the availability of generation capacity, particularly when there is not an obvious business case for keeping that capacity, at least from a conventional energy market functioning perspective. So the logic was nicely described to me by Emma as being about megawatts rather than megawatt hours, essentially. So generation capacity rather than the actual delivered energy itself. This capacity has historically been fossil or nuclear, given its dispatchability, but it's increasingly also extended to renewable forms of storage or even demand-side flexibility solutions, which to me sounds slightly bizarre on the face of it, essentially paying facilities just to exist. But it is one of the key mechanisms used to ensure security of supply, right? So maybe, Leo, you could give a bit of background for the uninitiated.
Well, yes, let me try to give a simplistic view of the history, and then Emma can come in and give us a more detailed view. But very simplistically, as you said, we have an energy market, we have an electricity market giving money when you produce electricity. Why is that not enough? Well, some utilities at some point in time started to say, well, we're not making enough money in these electricity markets, just producing. And often that was initially related to gas and coal plants. And then they said, but are you sure you want us to close them down? Because maybe you still need us in a few hours of the year. And then in some countries, public authorities were indeed worried that they might still want to use them in a few hours of the year. And that's how a concept of strategic reserves emerged.
Yeah.
It's like power plants, we probably don't need often anymore, but just to be sure, we put them on the side, we pay them to exist, as you said, to not completely close down. And then if we really need them, they come to save the day.
Yeah.
Strategic reserves. then the idea is, of course, that you don't want to use them all the time, because once you have these strategic reserves and prices are a bit high, so you're not really in trouble yet, but prices are high, maybe the tendency is that you start to activate them also at these moments when it's not strictly needed.
Yeah.
And that's then leading potentially to a slippery slope effect, because if you then activate them too often, you are reducing prices. As a result, some other power plants maybe start to say the same, but you just made it harder for us to survive in the market. So can we please also be part of these strategic reserves? And that slippery slope effect led then other countries to say, maybe if we do that for some capacity, maybe it's better we just do it for all capacity.
Yeah.
And that's then the difference between a strategic reserve and a capacity market. But both are then referred to as capacity mechanisms, which is a more general term to refer to these things. But as you said, even if it is used maybe first for coal plants, gas plants, after a while we said, okay, but why only for these plants? You know, it should, if it's really about ensuring problems we can face in scarcity, we should allow all type of resources to contribute. So also storage and the demand side. In some cases, even energy savings projects, because then you don't need these plants anymore, right? If you long-term do savings. Okay, so now we know the origin. Can consumers benefit from this? Well, hopefully yes. In different ways have been argued in also by academics. One is that you say, maybe this is a sector where we don't want the normal business cycles to occur, because in other businesses, in other sectors, you also sometimes have times of overcapacity, times of undercapacity. But maybe here in electricity, we don't really like that to happen. So if a capacity mechanism can help to sort of, avoid some of these cycles or smoothing them out, that could be a value to consumers as well. And also it could help maybe to reduce the risk and the capital costs. And then in the end, consumers do benefit. The fear, however, for a long time in Europe was that it could also be abused. Because some of these utilities that initially were asking, the perception was, and probably not only the perception, partly the truth was, that it was sometimes asked to compensate for plants that were maybe dirty old plants that shouldn't have been there in the first place. So a bit of state aid. Some of these companies were also state-owned. So yeah, there could also be abuse besides proper use of this kind of mechanisms. That's why the EU regulatory framework was initially rather focused on limiting the abuse. For instance, by having emission standards on the kind of plants that could be supported through these kind of mechanisms. But the big change was the last crisis. We just had an energy crisis, and during that crisis or after the crisis, I think some skeptics on these mechanisms changed their view. I was one of them, for instance. We now see, more and more people see, that during that crisis, we had an unprecedented level of intervention. So we didn't really allow the business cycle to do its work. If we would have not done anything, prices would have been very high. This would have triggered a lot of investment, but we intervened. So that undermined a bit the investment confidence, which is unfortunate, but we need more investment. So maybe the way we handled that crisis and the political backlash also we saw during the crisis of having these kind of cycles, questions even the usefulness of electricity markets altogether. So then I changed my view also, saying like I prefer to have markets with a bit more guidance of investment than no markets at all, because that would be really worrying. And also the regulatory framework changed because we now have in the last reform capacity mechanisms not mentioned anymore as a last resort type of instrument, but as something that could be structurally part of the electricity market. And as the mechanisms will also, the approval process will be streamlined. And this is exactly what Emma's first paper is about, not only our first paper for her PhD, but also the inspiration for the policy brief. Right, Emma?
Yeah, indeed. And thank you for this introduction and this nice background story of these capacity mechanisms. And maybe I can first elaborate a bit on the current EU framework, which you described So the clean energy package approach back in 2019 was that an energy-only market, so without any capacity mechanism, should be sufficient to provide the necessary investment incentives, so to have enough resources in our system. So capacity mechanisms were indeed really tolerated temporarily and as really last resort measures. And there is a quite strict framework to limit their use and abuse, as you say. So member states need to prove that they will have an adequacy issue with very rigorous adequacy assessments. They need also to implement a plan to correct for potential market flows that led to this inadequacy issue. If that's not enough, they can introduce the reserve, which you also described can be problematic. And only if the reserve is not enough, then they can introduce market-wide, also a bigger capacity mechanism, so a capacity market. So you see how they were really thought out of the European target model for the market design. So now we have the discussion is a bit changing. And one other key requirement, which I haven't discussed, that was introduced in the clean energy package for capacity markets, is that they shouldn't only allow all local resources to participate, but also all foreign or at least neighboring resources to participate. And that's quite a big thing to organize. And that's also what is called explicit cross-border participation, which I might say a lot during this podcast, and which we explored during the briefs.
So we've heard a lot of talk since the energy crisis about electricity market design, right? We even had you and Ellen on the podcast last season to talk about it. But how does the subject of capacity markets figure into these discussions?
Yeah, indeed, the energy crisis, as Leonardo said, led to a lot of debates around how to improve this electricity market design with a lot of focus on its long-term components. Because this long-term component can help avoiding high price spikes and price volatility, maybe hedge consumers. So a big focus was on long-term contracts, which you have already discussed in previous episodes. And of course, security of energy supply was brought to the forefront with the energy crisis. And capacity mechanisms are, well, the main instrument we can use in electricity markets to ensure this security of supply. And so in this context, the electricity market design reform recognized that capacity mechanisms are now a structural element, also as Leonardo said. So they are no longer these last resorts or temporary tools. And so you can see it's already quite a shift considering the previous clean energy package approach. And I want to say that this recognition makes sense considering also the current reality, because capacity mechanisms are actually currently really widespread in the EU. If we look at countries a bit adjusted for their size, so considering their generation capacity, we have broadly 1/3 of capacity markets, 1/3 of strategic reserves, and only 1/3 of more or less energy only, because some countries still have some form of legacy capacity payments, for example. So also these mechanisms that we have today, they don't seem temporary. They seem to be here to stay. And we hear about more and more countries discussing introducing a new capacity mechanism or replacing a targeted one for a market-wide one. So they're really continuing to expand. Now, if they are structural elements, as the market design reform says, well, capacity mechanisms should be easy to introduce by member states. So they should be able to introduce them in due time whenever they need them. But these mechanisms, they must be approved in the EU under state aid. And in the past, it has been quite a long and complex procedure. So the market design reform tasked the Commission to facilitate capacity mechanisms approval procedures and introduction through a streamlining process, which we should hear about in early 2025. So we look forward to hearing about it. And what does it have to do with our brief? Well, as explicit cross-border participation has been one of the most complex of the clean energy package requirements to implement, well, we looked at whether it was really needed or not in economical terms.
Okay, you already hinted to the brief itself. So the brief title is indeed about this streamlining, but we're only at the beginning of your PhD. So I just wanted to share also that for me, what was interesting about this work is it really changed the way I think of these mechanisms. And I think some of the listeners might also be surprised listening to some of the findings. So I would say, brace yourselves. Now, one thing that is often said about these mechanisms is, or let's say capacity markets, is that there are some countries, as you said, that have one, some that don't, right? Okay. But the view generally was that if you don't have one and your neighbor has one, you might be potentially free riding your neighbor because your neighbor is paying for the existence of power plants. You're not, but you can still benefit from them because when they produce power, it can also go to you, right? So that was a bit the view among many people, that there would be this free riding. Then we discovered through Emma, as you do often, you start a PhD or a master thesis by looking at the literature. And there were already some people describing that problem. And then discussing to what extent the problem is free riding or something else. But what Emma did is to show the problem in all its aspects. And also what I learned is that how you look at it from a methodological point of view, how you analyze the problem, really reveals the problem in a different way. So that was very interesting. The biggest surprise for me was when we analyzed, as you said, this regulatory remedy, this explicit cross-border participation. So there, as you said, it was about trying to reduce the discrimination because you have a free riding problem, but you potentially also have a discrimination problem that all of a sudden some power plants can get access to some money from a national mechanism, but then the others cannot anymore. So that's a discrimination problem as well, potentially. So we actually expected, if I remember well, when you started the research, that we thought that remedy made sense on the look of it. So then when you start to analyze it mathematically with simulations, we actually were surprised. And that surprise then led to this policy brief. Because that was not our intention, right? When we started the research, that was not the idea to contribute to that streamlining. So yeah, Emma, maybe you can explain us a bit better how that recommendation looks like and how we got there.
Yeah, maybe I can start with the problem, so the root of the issue. So the root of the issue is that on the one side, we are interconnected. We have a common integrated European wholesale markets. But on the other side, we have a patchwork of different capacity mechanisms operated at the national level. And in particular, we have 5 capacity markets. But capacity markets can have negative impact on neighboring countries. Basically, capacity markets tend to reduce energy prices and in particular scarcity prices. And this reduction spills over neighboring countries through cross-border trades. Why is that a problem? Well, in the short term, you could say that's a good thing. My neighbors are benefiting from more imports available, so they are benefiting from more of my generators, and these imports are also maybe cheaper. That's what we would call free riding, right? But now let's look at the long term. Well, a reduction in prices will lead to a reduction in investment incentives in that neighboring country. So if this country doesn't have any mechanism in place to also secure its capacity level, well, the capacity market of its neighbor ends up reducing its level of generation capacity installed and eventually its security of supply. So to sum up, in an interconnected context and in the long run, introducing a capacity market at the national level will only lead to displace generation capacity from one country to the other and not actually enhance security of supply if we look at the regional point of view. So that's a bit what we try to look at in this brief and accompanying paper.
Okay, so just taking one step back, so I think we've already covered a lot of ground. We've done the logic behind capacity mechanisms, why they're different to other kinds of long-term contracts and agreements. We've gone a little bit into the history of why they were required, their impact on the energy crisis, perhaps what we learned and the impulses it created for redesign going forward. Now we've just covered a little bit the national level implications, and you've begun to explain some of the risks of the relationship between national cross-border discrimination and so on and so forth. I mean, the EU's come with a regulatory remedy for this, if I understand, to sort of avoid this non-discrimination between domestic and non-domestic capacity markets. Could you perhaps explain a little bit about that?
Yes, so indeed the clean energy package required that these national capacity markets should allow for foreign resources to participate in the auctions, which is called explicit cross-border participation. And one first reason to do that is really legal, because non-discrimination between the local and same foreign resources is actually a key aspect of any of the EU internal markets, not only energy. And there was a hope as well that this would solve all the issues so that it would mitigate these externalities. Why? Because if we now allow these foreign generators to get a payment, maybe we will restore investment incentives. But we found out it cannot really work. Why? Because the foreign generators in these energy-only zones, they should always perceive a revenue from this cross-border participation close to zero, because there will always be an oversupply of these foreign generators to the capacity market zone, which you could also read about maybe more in detail in the brief. But to put it simply, the pricing observed with explicit cross-border participation is flawed or distorted due to the asymmetry in market design. So the price we observe is not really fixing any externality.
Okay, so what I understand is that it's not perhaps worth organizing this explicit participation of foreign generators, but we do have to consider for imports still somehow, right?
Yeah, indeed. It's crucial to consider for imports also, as we are more and more interconnected. Because if I try to reach my national adequacy without considering imports or by underestimating them, well, I will just overshoot my local capacity needs, and that can be really costly, like 10 or even 20% more cost for the system. So imports do have to be considered in capacity markets somehow. And the simpler way to do so is to just do implicit cross-border participation, which we have already done in the past, because it was a simpler rule. How does it work? Well, to operate my capacity markets, I need to estimate overall what will be my maximum electricity demand, like over a year, and when will this peak demand happen. Then based on that, I can try to forecast how much imports I can receive from the neighboring countries during these scarcity periods. And I can just deduce these imports from my demand, and what I obtain is my local needs. And then I have solved the overshoot issue, right? So that's this simple way to do so. But historically, this rule wasn't really liked because it wasn't super transparent. Basically, member states could apply implicit. They used to do it, also because they didn't want to pay for too much capacity, but they were still underestimating this import contribution. But what we say also is that now, with the current frameworks that has been developed for explicit cross-border participation, we have new tools and assessment frameworks allowing us to properly implement implicit, so to measure this import contribution and properly include it in capacity market demands.
Okay, well, very interesting. I think we've talked a lot about this, the generation and the need and matching and avoiding discrimination. There's a key component here, of course, that we've perhaps not touched on yet, the interconnectors, right? I mean, to do this properly, you need the requisite capacity of the interconnectors, and they need also paying for their service, right? So how do they factor into this?
It's a good question, because interconnectors are indeed an essential element for adequacy. You don't have imports if you don't have the interconnector. So it has been argued a lot that they should be compensated somehow through these capacity markets. But here we are not convinced. So one first thing to highlight is that introducing a capacity market unilaterally, so only in one country, will first distort their congestion rents in energy markets. And this distortion can be negative. Then there you could say maybe it's good to compensate them, but it can actually also be positive because of this displacement of generation capacity in the long term. And then the question is, should we change even more their congestion revenues? Then with explicit cross-border participation, depending on how it is implemented, we expect that interconnectors should get most of the payments between the capacity market and an energy-only zone. But this capacity congestion does not really reflect the value of the interconnector. Again, it only reflects the asymmetry in market design. So it doesn't seem to be the best way of pricing the value of interconnectors for adequacy. And a last point, I think, is that interconnectors in the EU are now mainly non-merchant. Actually, investment decisions are basically done through EU-level frameworks and assessments. We have the TENI regulation. So maybe it's not worth trying to tweak their investment incentives with such a complex rule and imperfect rule. So yeah, maybe let's just use already the EU frameworks we have for interconnectors.
Okay, that makes sense. It's clear that you've thought extremely deeply about this subject. It's really congratulations for the work. And I think the policy brief itself is extremely well written and very clear. I understand you have essentially two principal conclusions, right, going forward with these kind of solutions as you see it. Maybe you could elaborate those for us just briefly.
Yeah, well, thank you first for the compliment. And indeed, we have two main recommendations. One more for the short term, so for the streamlining, and one more for the long term to really solve the issue. So first, what could we do in the short term? Well, we recommend tolerating implicit cross-border participation rather than pushing for a fully fledged explicit cross-border participation. Because as I just discussed, both rules theoretically achieve the same not satisfying results in terms of mitigating externalities, but explicit is much more complex to implement. So if we really want to streamline capacity mechanisms and facilitate their introduction, well, being less strict about explicit is really already a good improvement. Second, what can we do in the medium to long term? Well, it's crucial to work on a proper solution because the root of the issue is this market design fragmentation, having so many different types of market designs. And what we say is that there is no cross-border participation rule that can properly solve this issue and these externalities. Also, these externalities, we believe they might become a growing issue because we have more and more capacity markets appearing. We hear about Germany, Spain, Sweden wanting to introduce a new one. And also increasing interconnectivity means we will have stronger cross-border effects. So they become really important and crucial to address. So maybe we can try to identify routes for more harmonization and eventually integration. So as we did with the short term and balancing markets, we could actually start harmonizing and Europeanizing these capacity mechanisms. This seems for now quite an easy task because as we often hear, capacity mechanisms have been really tailored to member states' needs. But I'm more optimistic because I think we already see today a convergence in some elements of this mechanisms design. We have more and more market-wide capacity markets, often reliability options, etc. So maybe in a few years, we'll manage to find a model that works more or less for everyone. And to conclude, eventually, adequacy could be considered even more at the EU level than at this really national level. Why? Because, well, we have increasing variable renewable generation, increasing interconnectivity. So we know we are more and more reliant on each other for our adequacy. It becomes increasingly hard to separate this exercise and the operation of these mechanisms. So that's what I would conclude.
And I was also still allowed to add some additional conclusion just to promote Emma's work even more if this podcast was not already achieving that, which is, of course, this Europeanization is one additional step in Emma's research, explaining as Emma already started doing, why we need it is what the current paper does, but then the how, right? The how, there is still a lot of questions on how far we go in harmonization, coordination, and the pro and con of the different steps. But, and that connects a bit with the previous time we had Emma on the podcast, when we discussed other aspects of this electricity market reform, which includes the issue of flexibility.
Yeah.
So there is also a conversation going on to what extent flexibility, non-fossil flexibility, so it's storage and demand response, can be promoted through capacity mechanism or through separate mechanisms. And this is also something Emma will address in her PhD. And now the biggest problem we have, and if our listeners have suggestions, we're very happy to hear them, is which to do first.
Yeah.
We have two really important topics, very timely and very relevant in the ongoing discussions in all capitals, but we only have one Emma. That's the biggest problem we have right now. So I don't know, if anyone has a suggestion, please do. And I don't know if we want to say something on the next episodes as well.
Yes, why not? So we're planning to have Christopher Jones back on, who is a former guest from episode 1 and episode 1, season 1. And in season 1, he was talking about CCUS, and surprise, surprise again, season 2, CCUS is back again, right? So he should be our next guest for next month, and we're very excited to have him back on.
He had a policy brief, and now he has a roadmap.
Yes, exactly. It's growing. It's
growing, yes.
Finally, CCUS is coming up.
So that's one strategy to get back on the podcast.
Exactly. We'll check in.
And then Katarina is new in our school as a part-time professor, and she looked at the Draghi report and at TENI, and then made a really interesting comparison and some discussion on the difference as well, and with a lot of ideas for research. So she's also out kind of a roadmap again for future research at FSR. So
very exciting. All right. Well, thank you so much, Emma, for joining us. It was a real pleasure. I think I learned a lot. This wasn't in the script, but I have a sort of curious question. During the gas crisis, during the energy crisis, at some point, huge gas consumers, like utilities, were being paid not to consume. I mean, this is a kind of ad hoc capacity mechanism, right? They were being remunerated for what is essentially demand destruction. Or have I...
They were in some countries, you could call that demand response. If you would have done that through a capacity mechanism,
yes,
you could call that a kind of procurement. But if it would have been procured beforehand, right, and activated during the crisis, then you could call that a kind of demand response contract.
But my understanding was kind of basically an ad hoc decision, in this sense. It was not bid, it was not deliberately designed, but the function is...
You could include that type of bidding into a capacity mechanism, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
So that was it. Thanks everyone for listening, and hope to see you soon in future episodes.